Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Hello, I'm Stephen Willis, and this is the extra edition of the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. And I'm joined by Brad Logan, who's going to be your Monday night guide through this week of basically waiting to a bowl game. But we'll get to that in a second. Ole Miss just won its third out of fourth Egg Bowls. As we talked about this morning, the 3 out of 4 they've taken. And that has happened pretty consistently by coaches on both sides, but not many coaches can win 4 out of 5. That's kind of where you hit that special territory. And that's kind of where Lane Kiffin is living at the moment, Brad.
Yeah, it really is. I think when you look at what Ole Miss was able to do on Thursday night, and by the time, folks watch or listen to this, Mississippi State probably has a new head coach in Jeff Lebby. But what we saw was an interim coach. We saw a team in Mississippi State that, quite frankly, was playing really well and playing as well as it had all year, specifically defensively. And I think that had a lot to do with Ole Miss. I think the Rebels are, frankly, I think they're kind of out of gas right now. They're searching on the offensive line because of injury. But I think at the end of the day, what you're able to do is win the football game. That's all that matters. When you look in the record books 20, 30 years from now, it's either going to have an L or a W, and they're not going to care how you got to that W, but at the end of the day, that's what happened. A couple of things happened late in that game. I think it was important. J.J. Pegues with the fourth down play was a huge play to get Ole Miss over the hump. But previously, Stephen, I talked about a couple of plays that really stood out to me. Number one was the fourth down play to Jordan Watkins. I thought it was drawn up perfectly. Ole Miss was going to add points. And then just quite frankly, the way the defense played all game long. They did jump off sides. Will Rogers got the free play and went up top. They got the interception that was negated. But I think just the way the defense held all day long and only allowing Mississippi State to really have one productive drive all night long.
Yeah, and one thing that was interesting in that game, I think nobody really knew how injured Jackson Dart was going into that Egg Bowl. And then they started talking to Jordan Rogers, talking about how he couldn't even hand the ball off with his left hand against Louisiana Monroe. And now he ran super hard. And as a student of the Ole Miss football program that you are, I'm going to say that Jackson Dart might be the toughest quarterback that has played quarterback at Ole Miss since Tommy Luke. That is the one I keep going back to.
Speaking of Tom, I had a chance to talk to him before the game, and he was nervous. We would learn that Dejan Robinson would tell us in the press conference at the end of the game that Tom Luke addressed the team prior to the Egg Bowl on Tuesday night, was very emotional, talking about the Ole Miss Mississippi State game and how much it meant to him personally. And Dejan Robinson at that point talked about how that's kind of when everything started, and Dejan Anthony, I'm sorry. And that's kind of when the game really started clicking in regards to getting ready for the Egg Bowl. But, you talked about toughness. I think you got to go to Matt Corral when he played at Auburn in Tennessee when he was playing so banged up. It reminds me a lot of that. As banged up as Jackson Dart was, I think from a decision standpoint and maybe some throws he made, not his best game. I don't think. But I think from a toughness standpoint, from I'm going to be an Ole Miss Rebel, I'm proud to be a Rebel, I mean, it'd be tough to really put anybody else ahead of him. When he wanted the ball late in the game, when he can't feel his left shoulder, he can't feel his right ankle, and he gets the first down running over a Mississippi State defender, that tells you all you need to know about Jackson Dart as a Rebel. Because at the beginning of the game, I took a picture, tweeted it out, no brace in his right ankle, no nothing. And within a couple of plays in the first quarter, he couldn't hardly walk. He goes under the tent. No idea what happens under the tent, but he comes out. He's got a lot of tape on that right leg. So you knew from that moment that Jackson Dart was not going to be very mobile. He was not, but he was fortunate enough to have a running back like a Quinshon Judkins that ran with his hair on fire. I think the third thing that I forgot to mention a moment ago, the targeting foul on Mississippi State completely changed the game. At that point, Greg Knox, the interim coach at MSU, talked about how it changed the game from their standpoint. I get it. I mean, I can see where he would be coming from. I think from the Ole Miss standpoint, it changed the game not because of some 15-yard penalty or an automatic first down. The momentum changed. Jackson Dart was a different person when he came back in the game. Quinshon Judkins changed. He flipped the switch, so to speak, and he ran
turned
much
into Earl
differently.
Campbell.
Yeah, he did. Some of those angry runs that we talked about him running all year. So, it did flip the script. But once again, I think it's important to dissect the fact that Ole Miss may not have played well, but I think it's important also to point out that Mississippi State played really, really hard. They played really hard for their coach. The defense and Jet Johnson and Bookie Watson played two of the best linebackers in the conference. I thought the defensive front with Nathan Pickering created problems all night long. I thought Mississippi State played really hard. Offensively, they just didn't really have the horses. Ole Miss did a great job of limiting Woody Marks. Will Rogers obviously was still hurt, did not throw the ball really well, so they weren't very good offensively. But defensively, they made it tough. I really think that you made a good point. At some point during the game, you said this is setting up to be a 31-7. And I agree. But Mississippi State, once again, didn't let go of the rope, to use a Houston Nutt phrase. They really stood strong, and they played hard for Greg Knox. And I think that's why it was so hard for Ole Miss to score the other night.
Yeah, there was the holding penalty. Ole Miss was going to go in to make it 24-7.
Right.
Whenever I tweeted that, and there was a holding penalty, put them back behind the chains, and Mississippi State was able to get off the field. But at that point, honestly, when the kid missed the field goal, the game was over, because
the 50-yard field goal that hit the crossbar.
Yes,
yeah,
whenever
that would have got them
happened,
within one score.
Yeah, and they weren't scoring twice after that. And I get that people might have gotten upset about that, and nervous because of this game, but Pete Golding all season has just feasted on mid to bad offenses, and that was no different Thursday night.
No, it wasn't. And, let's look at 10,000 feet. I just thought it was important to bring that up about how I think not enough people are crediting Mississippi State about how well they played defensively. But no, let's look at the 10,000 feet view. Let's talk about Lane Kiffin for a moment. Just what he's been able to do as head coach at Ole Miss. And not necessarily the Egg Bowl. I mean, he's 3-1 against Mississippi State, was that close from being 4-0. Just what he's been able to do on the road in SEC night games. I mean, his percentage is off the charts. It's like 70%. The closest person is like 48% for Ole Miss in program history. He's the winningest coach since John Vaught, and that was about 1971 or 70, whenever the last time he was there. And then after Vaught, it just drops off like a rock, right, after Lane. So the winningest coach since Johnny Vaught, and what he's been able to do from a bowl game standpoint. And then you start asking yourself, well, is he worth the $9.5 million? I think from a marketing standpoint, absolutely. I mean, you can look at the social engagement that you see with his name attached to it, all of the engagement. You can look at enrollment. Now, I don't know if you can directly tie the freshman enrollment to the success of the football program, but I think Alabama has done some studies, and I think you can look at what Ole Miss has done over the last couple of years under Lane, and it's mind-boggling. And I think at the end of the day, Ole Miss is in as good a position as it's ever been from coaching standpoint, with Mike Bianco, with Chris Beard in the men's basketball program, and Coach Yo, the women's program. I'd be hard-pressed to say it's a better combination of coaches than any in program history.
Let's change the subject real quick and talk about the bowl situation. And we're about 7 days from knowing exactly where we are going to be, whether it's in Orlando for the Citrus Bowl or in Dallas or Atlanta in the NY6. Now, I was kicking anthills, and I've been known to do that from time to time. And today's target was the Missouri fans, because I genuinely think that if you want to make this a metric-based conversation, there's not a world where Missouri has a better resume than Ole Miss, but they're ranked higher going into this Tuesday's ranking than Ole Miss. But we're looking at Missouri not having a ranked win, a loss to a team Ole Miss beat, and Ole Miss is going to be 2 spots behind them. I think if Ole Miss can move up and get right next to them, maybe if Penn State jumps Missouri to where they're next to each other, I think that by the time that the bowls are actually divvied out, Ole Miss will make that jump over them.
Why is Missouri over Ole Miss?
In your opinion? Know. They are over Ole Miss because of everybody was shocked at how well they played a Georgia team without Mims and Bowers.
Right.
That
That's the main reason. They're looking at Ole Miss's game against Georgia and Missouri's game against Georgia, and they're forgetting the fact of the other stats that you pointed out. How Ole Miss, not to mention their strength of schedule, not to mention the opponents that Ole Miss has played on the road that they lost to. I think did you tweet that at 24-1?
23-1. Alabama is 11-1 and Georgia's 12-0. So it's 23-1.
Not to mention a team that they've already beaten. Tulane is 11-1. The only loss is to Ole Miss, and people seem to forget that as well. You look at the games that Ole Miss beat, and what really frustrates me is when people say that a team gets lucky. That is the laziest take that you can make when you describe a loss to a team. When you talk about a team like, is it fair to say that Alabama was lucky that they beat Auburn? No, they're not lucky because Nick Saban at the end of the game talked about they practiced the play, which we would learn is Gravedigger.
Yeah, great name.
Yeah, great, very fitting. But we would learn that they practiced that play, and it was ran to perfection. This is not something they drew up on the sideline and you got lucky. That's something they practice. And when Hugh Freeze doesn't realize that the punt returner is not the same guy that normally is in there, and he didn't even know it at the end of the game, that's not luck. That's coaching. And so, that's just a little foolish, I think, to say that Ole Miss was lucky that they beat Tulane, and they were lucky that they beat LSU. And, they weren't lucky. They outplayed them. They beat LSU because they got the ball last, and then they were somehow able to stop Jaden Daniels, who's going to win the Heisman Trophy. I think he is. It may be Bo Nix, but, we'll see.
It should be Jaden Daniels.
It should be, but it wouldn't surprise me if they go out west and give it to Bo Nix for whatever reason, Pac-12. It's just, I get so frustrated with the people that have so much bias towards the SEC. And it feels like, I don't know if I'm just living in a bubble, but it feels like people find any way they can to jump on Ole Miss and discredit what they have done under Lane Kiffin. It really frustrates me that you put 1-1 Ole Miss versus Missouri, and I can't fathom how you would have Missouri ahead of Ole Miss. And people talk about, well, you have to earn it. You have to earn your seat at the table. That's all fine and good. But what Ole Miss has done since 2020 under Lane Kiffin is much better than what Drinkwitz has done at Missouri. So, but I do think if Penn State does jump Missouri and you put Ole Miss and Missouri side by side, I think the tail of the tape.
They're not going to win whenever that final poll comes out, because right now it's still the made-for-TV type stuff as well. And honestly, I'm not 100% sure if Missouri went down and played in Yulman Stadium against Tulane, that Tulane doesn't beat them straight up.
I'm not either. And, Ole Miss was fortunate. I'm not going to say lucky, but they were fortunate that they didn't have Michael Pratt, although I don't know that he would have made that big of a difference that day. Ole Miss played really well defensively. And they limited Tulane, and then Ole Miss really caught fire down the stretch and kind of woke up. Even Lane Kiffin admitted at the beginning of the game that they were a little lifeless on the road. So, long story short, I think Ole Miss still wins, but I don't know if Missouri can beat this Tulane team. Tulane was better than a lot of the SEC teams that Ole Miss faced this year.
So, what's your read going into bowl selection Sunday? How do you think it's actually going to play out when all things are said and done?
Let me answer the question like this. I think Ole Miss is going to play in the Citrus Bowl. I think Ole Miss fans want to play in the Cotton Bowl against insert Big 12 team here. I do think there's a chance that Ole Miss gets sent to the Peach Bowl, depending on what happens in the Big 10. I think the way it shakes out is you could have an Ole Miss versus Iowa matchup in the Citrus Bowl. And believe it or not, I would kind of be excited about that because you have Iowa's defense is so good and, an Ole Miss offense. I don't know what kind of Ole Miss team you're going to put on the field because who knows who's going to be where. Who knows who's going to enter the portal here. Who knows who's coming back here. Are they going to play in the bowl game? Since it's not a national championship type game, what happens? I do think more players would play in the New Year's Six than the Citrus, but, what do I know? It will be fun to see, but I think if you were to pin me down right now, I would say Ole Miss plays in the Citrus Bowl.
So Ole Miss beats Iowa, right? Let's just, for the sake of hypothetical, say Ole Miss beats Iowa in the Citrus Bowl. We're going into 2024, the 12-team playoff. You're looking at Ole Miss preseason. If everybody comes back like we think, 7th in the country, somewhere in there.
Top 10. Yeah. There's a lot of water to cross under the bridge with a couple of NIL packages that have to be discussed. I'll allow the listeners and viewers to make their own summations there, but there's some things that the Grove Collective has to shore up. And I think if they do that with the recruiting class you have coming in, remember, this is the worst defense that will probably be under the direction of Pete Golding. Mm-hmm. That's something Ole Miss fans can grasp on. And the offense is going to continue to get better. The recruiting classes, everything that I've seen, it looks really promising for 24 and 25. I mean, even the 25 players that David Johnson of 24/7 Sports has spoken with has been very proactive when it comes to Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. And I do think Lane Kiffin has a couple more years left in Oxford. We'll see, down the road. But I think over the next couple of years, it could be the best run since the 50s, maybe. Since Ole Miss won the national championships in the 60s or 50s, whenever it was, I don't remember. But, I think it's an incredible run for Ole Miss football without question.
Yeah, it's kind of glory days 2.0, kind of where we are right now. It's interesting. Anyway, thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Brad Logan from Inside the Rebels on the Red and Blue Crew podcast, the Mac South High School Sports Broadcasting. Brad, you're everywhere, buddy. Thank you, man.
Always a pleasure.